I hosted a party to celebrate my 60th birthday. My wife and my son handed me a gift. Inside it was a piece of paper that turned out to be an eviction notice and divorce papers. The business, the house, everything was gone. My son mocked me, saying I was a pathetic old failure. They burst out laughing. I signed the papers and walked out. But 1 week later there were 32 desperate phone calls. The night breeze brushed softly across my face. The smell of honey-glazed ribs drifted through the air. Lanterns hanging from the old oak tree cast a warm golden glow. I stood in front of the grill holding the same pair of meat tongs I had used for years. Around me were the voices and laughter of neighbors and longtime business partners. Today I turned 60 years old. 60 years of life filled with struggle and hard-earned victories. I had built Hendricks Construction from absolutely nothing. I once carried heavy bags of cement under the burning sun just to create the foundation for everything I now owned. I looked toward the main table. Chloe, my wife, was smiling gracefully while talking with her friends. She was wearing the emerald silk dress I bought for her last year. Paul, my son, stood beside her. He held a glass of wine and carried himself like the successful businessman I had always been proud of. A deep sense of satisfaction filled my chest. I told myself that all the hardship I endured had finally been rewarded with a peaceful and happy family. Suddenly Paul cleared his throat and lightly tapped his glass. The crowd fell silent and turned toward my son. "Dad, we have a special gift for you," Paul announced loudly. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket. Chloe stepped closer and placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Open it, Robert," she whispered. I set the meat tongs down and wiped my hands on my apron. My heart began beating faster, a mixture of curiosity and emotion. I thought it might be tickets for a trip around the world, or maybe a family photograph framed in silver. Slowly I opened the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. The very first line I saw made my breath catch in my throat. "Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. I am truly glad you are here. Make sure you subscribe to follow my story all the way to the end, and leave a comment with the city you are watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled." Notice of termination of residency and eviction. I blinked, thinking I must have read it wrong. I turned to the next page. A unilateral divorce filing with terms that stripped me of every piece of our shared property. Everything inside my head started spinning. This house, this company, the bank accounts. None of it belonged to me anymore. I looked up at Chloe, hoping this was nothing more than a cruel joke. But her face had turned cold as ice. Her eyes were filled with a level of contempt I had never seen in 25 years of marriage. Paul stepped forward, tilting his chin at me with open arrogance. He leaned close to my ear, making sure I heard every poisonous word. "You are a pathetic old failure," Paul sneered. "Your time is over. Now it is time for you to disappear so I can run everything." Their laughter exploded right after that, loud and merciless. The guests around us began whispering, but not one person stepped forward to help me. I felt like a wounded animal being exposed in the middle of a crowd. The blood in my veins burned, then suddenly turned ice cold. I looked down at the papers, then at the fountain pen in Paul's pocket. "Give me the pen," I said, my voice dropping into something dangerously calm. Paul handed it to me with a victorious smile. I signed my name on those documents with firm, deliberate strokes. The scratching sound of the pen cutting across the paper felt like the sound of my own heart breaking. I removed the apron that said "World's #1 Dad." I placed it on the table right beside the plate of ribs, still steaming with heat. I did not say another word. I turned around and walked away, leaving behind the bright lights and the people who had betrayed me. I stepped out through the gate with less than $400 in my pocket. But in the middle of that collapse, a single thought flashed through my mind. They had forgotten who laid the foundation of this kingdom. I walked along the sidewalk of the wealthy neighborhood. Most of the mansions here had been built by my company. Every brick, every fence carried the mark of my sweat. I remembered 3 years ago when I became seriously ill. Chloe cried beside my hospital bed and said she needed power of attorney to protect the family. Because I loved her, because I trusted her, I signed without a single doubt. It turned out she had been preparing for this day from that very moment. She and my son had been quietly moving assets for a long time. They isolated me from major projects. They convinced me I was getting old and needed to step back. This betrayal hurt far more than any physical wound I had ever suffered. I stopped at an old gas station at the end of the street. I pulled out my worn wallet and checked inside. $327. That was all I had left after 30 years of devotion. Enough for one night at a cheap motel and a few simple meals. But when I looked at my reflection in the gas station window, I saw a man who had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. Paul thought he had won because he had the money. Chloe thought she had won because she had the house. But they were wrong. They had awakened an old lion that they should have left sleeping. I would not use a gun. I would not use a knife. I would take my revenge, using the same things that built my entire career: patience, strategy, and the cold precision of a master builder. This game had only just begun, and the ending would make them regret it for the rest of their lives. I staggered along the dark road. Paul's laughter still echoed faintly behind the iron gate. My mind drifted back to the winter of 2023. That was when the severe pneumonia made my lungs feel like they had frozen solid. I was lying in a hospital bed at the Central Medical Center. Around me was the lifeless beeping of heart monitors. Chloe sat beside me, her eyes red from crying. She held my hand, those warm hands I had trusted for so many years. "Robert, the company is in trouble without your signature," she sobbed. "The suppliers are threatening to stop deliveries. The workers are worried because they have not been paid." She placed a thick stack of documents in front of me. She said it was only a limited power of attorney to handle temporary matters, so that I could focus on recovering without worrying about the business. At that time, my mind was clouded by antibiotics and a fever that refused to break. I looked into my wife's eyes and saw nothing but sincere concern. I picked up the pen and signed exactly where she pointed. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I had signed a full power of attorney that could not easily be reversed. I had handed them the key to the treasure I spent 30 years building. The moment I was discharged from the hospital, the changes began quietly. Paul started changing the passwords to the internal management systems. He said it was to protect company information from competitors. Chloe began taking over every email account and every phone call from the banks. Whenever I wanted to review the books, they used my health as a shield. "Dad needs to rest. The doctor said you must not deal with stress," Paul would say. They arranged long vacations for me in distant places. It turned out that was their way of isolating me from my most loyal partners. They fired the master craftsmen who had fought beside me for decades. They replaced them with people who only knew how to obey Paul. Tonight, standing under the dim streetlight, I finally understood the entire truth. This birthday party had never been meant to celebrate my life. It was a victory celebration for two traitors. They waited until every legal procedure was completely finished. They waited until I no longer had any value left for them. Paul stepped out onto the balcony of the house and looked down at me standing outside the fence. He held a stack of documents and threw them into the air. Sheets of paper fluttered down like pale moths in the night. "Those are copies of the tax reports you signed," Paul shouted. "Everything is completely legal, dear father. You cannot sue. You cannot take anything back, because you were the one who handed it all to us with your own signature." I watched the papers fall into a dirty puddle beside the road. The anger inside me ignited, burning away the shock that had frozen me moments earlier. I had not only lost my home, I had lost my faith in people. I looked back at the mansion one last time. Those dazzling lights now looked more like a glittering tomb, a tomb that had buried my kindness and my trust. I turned away and walked toward the town center. I needed somewhere to rest and think. I needed to find the weakness in the perfect trap they had built around me. They believed I had been disarmed. They believed I was just an old man waiting to die in poverty. But they forgot something important. The blueprint of that entire house still existed inside my head, and I knew exactly which wall to strike to bring their whole structure crashing down. I would make them regret letting me walk out of that gate alive. I stopped in front of the flickering neon sign of the Sunset Motel. The letters S and T were broken, leaving only the word UNS glowing dimly through the light drizzle. It was the cheapest place I could find on the edge of town. I pushed open the stained glass door and stepped into the reception area. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard looked at me with open suspicion. "One single room," I said, my voice rough from the cold. $50 a night. "Pay in advance," he replied shortly. I pulled a $50 bill from the small stack of cash in my wallet. My hand trembled slightly, as I placed it on the scratched wooden counter. He handed me a metal key attached to a red plastic tag. Room 12. End of the hallway on the left, he muttered, already turning back to the television. I walked down the hallway on a carpet that smelled of dampness and years of cigarette smoke. The door to room 12 opened with a dry squeal from hinges that had not seen oil in a long time. The space inside was cramped and suffocating. A single bed with a thin, worn blanket, an old television sitting on a crooked wooden shelf, and a small window overlooking a trash-scattered parking lot. I closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The weight of reality began pressing down on my chest. Just a few hours earlier, I had been the owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. Now I was sitting in a cheap room that even my workers would have complained about. I took out my wallet and emptied everything onto the mattress. A few wrinkled bills, my identification card, and the final balance on my phone's banking app, $327. I stared at my hands under the flickering fluorescent light on the ceiling. These calluses were proof of 30 years of labor. They had built dream homes for thousands of people, yet now they could not even hold onto a roof for the man who built them. I collapsed onto the bed, staring blankly at the stained ceiling. The loneliness of 60 years old crashed over me like a violent wave. I remembered the warm dinners I once shared with Chloe. I remembered teaching Paul how to read his very first construction blueprint. All of it had been a carefully staged performance. They had patiently waited for me to grow old. They had patiently waited for the moment I became vulnerable enough to take everything from me. The roar of a truck engine outside the motel startled me back to reality. I realized I could not lie here feeling sorry for myself. Their betrayal might have been a sentence, but I would turn it into a declaration of war. I sat up and opened the only bag I had managed to take with me. Inside there were no expensive clothes, only my identification papers and a small iron box. That box carried memories from the days when my parents were still alive. I placed my hand on the cold metal surface. In the darkness of the Sunset Motel, I made a silent promise to myself. Paul and Chloe might have taken my money, but they could never take my mind or my will. Tomorrow I would begin finding my way back, step by step, even if I had to start from the ashes. This rock bottom was not where my story ended. It was where I would begin laying a new foundation stronger than any structure I had ever built before. I reached over and switched on the old desk lamp. The weak yellow light trembled across the surface of the small iron box. It was the only thing I managed to grab when they forced me out of the house. Paul used to call it my pile of nostalgic junk. But to me, it was the last thread connecting me to the people who had truly loved me. I opened the lid. The dry scrape of metal echoed softly in the quiet room. Inside were a few medals from my college years, several black and white photographs of my parents, and a thick, light brown envelope resting at the bottom. Across the front, written in my mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Bobby." My throat tightened the moment my fingers touched her handwriting. My mother had been a frugal woman. She worked as a seamstress for years before opening a small bakery. She always told me, "A man needs an escape route when the storm comes, Bobby." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were not old letters. It was a savings book and a stack of deposit certificates. I opened the book and the numbers seemed to dance under the dim light. The final deposit had been made 2 months before she passed away. With decades of accumulated interest, the balance had reached $91,000. I froze. $91,000. To a millionaire, it would be pocket change for a minor project. But to a man sitting at rock bottom with only $327 left, it was a fortune. It was my mother's blood, sweat, and silent sacrifice over an entire lifetime. She had hidden it away. She never told my father. She never even told me. As if she had somehow foreseen the day her son would lose everything. I shuffled through the remaining papers. A short letter slipped out, the ink slightly faded. "Bobby, if you are reading this, it means life has become difficult for you. Do not feel ashamed to accept help from your old mother. Use this to start again because you are the finest builder I have ever known." Tears fell onto the page, blurring the word builder. While I had been busy building castles for people who would betray me, my mother had quietly built a lifeboat for me. I gripped the savings book tightly in my hand. Chloe and Paul believed they had drained the last drop of blood from me. They had no idea that a mother's love could reach beyond death to protect her child. This money was not just capital. It was salvation. It was proof that I was not alone in this fight. I looked out the small window. In the distance, the city lights still burned brightly. The plan for my revenge began to take shape more clearly in my mind. I would not waste a single dollar. That $91,000 would be the first brick, the brick that would shatter Paul's arrogance, the brick that would throw Chloe out of the house she had stolen. I placed the savings book back into the iron box and locked it carefully. Tonight, for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of calm. Their betrayal had been a death sentence for family bonds, but it had also been the rebirth of my strength. Sleep, Robert, I told myself. Tomorrow, the hunt begins. I was about to close the iron box when my fingers brushed against another rough layer of paper. It was wedged beneath the lining at the bottom of the box. I pulled it out carefully. It was an old land ownership certificate, yellowed with age, stamped sometime in the 1970s. The document listed the owner as my Uncle Thomas, my late bachelor uncle, who had passed away many years ago. A faint memory returned to me. He had left me a piece of land on the northern edge of the city. At the time, I had been at the peak of my career, managing dozens of multi-million-dollar construction projects. That 12-acre patch of weeds and gravel had felt more like a tax burden than an asset, so I forgot about it completely. Paul and Chloe certainly had no idea it even existed, because it had been inherited directly from the Hendricks family long before I married Chloe. I opened my phone, dust still clinging to my fingers, and started searching through the city planning maps. My heart began pounding when I saw the location on the newest satellite map. The land sat right along the border of the North Technology Development District. The city had recently announced plans to expand the roadway and build a new belt route cutting directly through that area. Property values there had skyrocketed over the past 2 years. What had once been worthless wilderness was now a potential gold mine. I checked several recent land transactions nearby. $137,000 per acre. 12 acres. The number forming in my mind forced me to hold my breath to stay calm. This was the leverage I needed. They believed they had taken everything by freezing the company accounts. But they could not touch what they did not know existed. The legacy of the Hendricks family was rising to protect the last heir who still carried its integrity. I looked out the window of the Sunset Motel as darkness slowly retreated before the first light of dawn. A detailed plan began forming in my mind like a 3-dimensional architectural blueprint. I would not sell the land immediately for quick cash. I would use it as collateral to rebuild my legal credibility. I would construct a new fortress on the very foundation they had overlooked. Chloe wanted money. She would watch money turn to dust. Paul wanted power. He would watch power collapse beneath the feet of the father he had mocked. I carefully placed the land certificate back into the box beside my mother's savings book. Tomorrow morning, my first destination would not be my old company. It would be the office of an old friend, the only man honest enough to stand against Chloe's army of lawyers. I lay down, but my eyes refused to close. I could still see Paul laughing at me during the party. Laugh while you can, my son. You took away what I built over 30 years. But I will take back everything, and the souls of the traitors along with it, and I will do it within a few short months. This battle is no longer about money. It is about proving that a true builder can never be defeated by those who only know how to steal the work of others. The sun had risen, and with it came the beginning of their end. 8 in the morning. I stood in front of the office building of Tom Bradley. Tom was an old lawyer known throughout the city for his integrity and for legal counterattacks that showed absolutely no mercy. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a brass bell rang sharply. Tom looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. His thick eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Robert, I heard about the party last night," he said quietly. "The whole city is talking about how your wife and son threw you out of your own house." I placed my bag on his desk and pulled out my mother's savings book and the yellowed land certificate. "I did not come here for sympathy, Tom," I replied coldly. "I came for justice." We spent the next 6 hours dissecting every detail of the documents. Tom studied each page of the power of attorney I had signed in the hospital. His eyes stopped at a small clause near the bottom of the final page. "They were clever, Robert," Tom said, tapping the paper lightly. "They inserted a clause allowing the appointed party to transfer shared marital assets. But in their greed, they made a fatal mistake." I held my breath. Tom slid my Uncle Thomas's land certificate back across the desk. This property is separate inherited land from before your marriage. Under the law, even with a full power of attorney, they cannot legally transfer or control separate inherited property without explicit written consent from you for that specific purpose. And that is not all. Tom gave a faint knowing smile. Your mother's savings account is also a direct personal inheritance. Any attempt by Chloe to merge it into marital assets or freeze it would be illegal. A surge of electricity ran through my spine. The wall they built was beginning to crack. Tom continued flipping through company documents related to Paul's management. He fired the old accountants and replaced them with his own people. That is a classic sign of someone trying to hide questionable financial flows, Tom said calmly. I looked him in the eyes, feeling the fire of revenge growing stronger. I want the power of attorney revoked immediately, I said firmly. And I want you to draft a notice to the banks establishing my exclusive ownership of the northern land. Tom nodded, his fingers already moving quickly across the keyboard. We are not just going to defend ourselves, Robert. We are going to strike their weakest point, their arrogance. I will submit the revocation of the power of attorney at the exact moment they are executing a major financial transaction. Their accounts will freeze at the very moment they believe they have already secured victory. I left Tom's office late in the afternoon. In my pocket was now a perfectly structured legal strategy. I walked down the street, watching the crowds moving quickly through the city. Chloe and Paul were probably enjoying their luxurious life inside my house. They had no idea that the sword of justice had already begun to slide out of its sheath. My silence today was not surrender. It was preparation for a storm they could never imagine. Everything they built on deception was about to collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. I did not stop with the lawyer's office. Real revenge requires more than legal paperwork. It requires the naked truth about your enemy. I used a small portion of my mother's money to hire an independent financial investigator. He was an old bloodhound of a man I had once helped when he was just starting out. 2 days later, we met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. He slid a thin folder across the table, but its contents carried enormous weight. Your son is not the business genius he thinks he is, Robert, he said. Paul is a professional debtor in the online gambling world. I opened the folder and felt my chest tighten. Paul had lost more than $200,000 on illegal offshore betting platforms. To cover those losses, he had done something unforgivable. He had secretly mortgaged the family home for $185,000. The house where I personally laid every single brick of the foundation. The house Chloe once swore she loved more than her own life. But that was not the end of it. Hendrick's construction had become nothing more than an empty shell. Paul had been using deposits from new construction projects to pay off his personal gambling debts. He now owed wages to workers and payments to dozens of subcontractors and material suppliers. A rot deep to the bone was spreading through the heart of the empire I built. He had not only betrayed me, he was destroying the Hendricks legacy itself. I scanned the list of stalled projects. One name stood out immediately. The Morrison Estate Project. Margaret Morrison was one of my most respected and demanding clients. She was known for having zero tolerance for delays or compromised quality. At that moment, I realized I had found their Achilles heel. Paul was desperately trying to keep everything hidden by using the power of attorney to drain the company's remaining reserve funds. If I cut off that financial lifeline now, the entire structure he built would explode. Creditors would descend like vultures smelling blood. And Chloe would finally realize that the son she protected was nothing more than a reckless destroyer. The truth was more bitter than I expected. But it gave me an absolute advantage. I did not need to destroy them myself. All I had to do was allow their greed and stupidity to destroy them. I paid the bill, gathered the folder, and stepped outside into the harsh sunlight. Inside my mind, a new move had already been placed on the board. I would contact Margaret Morrison. I would show her the truth about the man currently managing her project. And I would offer her a solution she could not refuse. Paul believed he had already won by taking control of the Hendricks name. But he forgot something important. Clients trusted that name because of me. Without credibility, a name is nothing more than a piece of paper. I tightened my grip on the folder, feeling strength returning to my bones. My enemies were digging their own grave. My only job now was to make sure there was no escape when the ground finally collapsed beneath them. I sat in my temporary office, a narrow room that still smelled of fresh paint. On the glass door, the words Hendricks Renovations were still drying. This was the new company I had just established using the money my mother saved for me. I picked up my phone. My finger hovered over one name: Margaret Morrison. She was a steel-willed woman who never tolerated delays. I pressed the call button. "Robert, I thought you retired to some island somewhere." Her sharp voice came through the phone. "I did not retire, Margaret. I am just cleaning up the ruins," I replied. I told her the truth about Paul's financial situation and the reality behind the construction of her mansion. Her face must have turned pale when she heard the number tied to my son's gambling debts. 1 hour later, we met at the stalled construction site. Machines stood silent. Workers sat around talking, unpaid and restless. Mrs. Morrison watched as Paul tried desperately to explain something to a material supplier who was demanding payment. My son looked pathetic in his expensive suit, his eyes darting around in fear. I stepped out from the shadow of the corridor. Paul froze. The coffee cup in his hand trembled. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he stammered. I did not answer him. I looked straight at Margaret Morrison. "I will take over this project with my new company," I said calmly. "I do not need a deposit. All I need is for you to sign a direct contract with me. I will personally cover the material costs using my land as collateral." Mrs. Morrison nodded without hesitation. "Paul, you are fired," she said coldly. I watched my son's face change from red to ghost white. "You cannot do this. You signed power of attorney to Mom," he shouted. That was when I pulled the notice from Tom Bradley out of my folder. "That power of attorney was revoked at 8 this morning, Paul," I said slowly. "Every account you plan to use to cover your gambling debts has been frozen for investigation. You do not have a single dollar left to move around anymore." He collapsed onto the ground among the scattered bricks and concrete. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a defeated man staring into the abyss. If you have stayed with this story until this moment, please take a quick second to subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing, and it helps us more than you know. I turned and walked away, ignoring the angry shouting of creditors who were now surrounding Paul. If this story meant something to you, press like and help share the message about resilience. My journey to reclaim justice was now 3/4 complete. Every step I took now was calculated like an architectural blueprint. I knew Chloe was probably at home at that very moment, trying to use her credit cards, only to have them rejected. Soon she would realize that the luxurious house she stole had become nothing more than a cage without food. I returned to my small office and opened the project blueprints for the Morrison estate. I would work through the night. I would rebuild the reputation of the Hendricks name with these very hands. Paul and Chloe believed they could steal my career with paperwork, but they forgot something. A career does not live on paper. It lives in the trust of the clients. And that trust is something they were never worthy of owning. Tonight, I will sleep deeply, because tomorrow the 32 desperate phone calls I promised you about will finally begin ringing. The circle is about to close, and satisfaction will belong to those who stood with integrity. Monday morning. I sat in my new office with a cup of black coffee, no sugar. The phone rested quietly on the wooden desk, silent, like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. I had already sent every piece of evidence of Paul's embezzlement to the board of directors and the company's largest creditors. I had also filed a formal request to freeze the house since it had been illegally mortgaged. At exactly 9:15, the desk began to vibrate. The first call, Paul. I let it ring until it stopped. The 5th call, still Paul. By the 10th call, it was Chloe. I answered, but said nothing, only listening. "Robert, what have you done? Why was my card declined at the grocery store?" Chloe screamed, her voice shaking with humiliation. "Creditors are standing at the front door. They are trying to repossess Paul's car. You have to unlock the accounts right now." I hung up without saying a word. The phone kept vibrating violently on the desk. Call 15. Call 20. Then call 30. Paul started sending frantic messages, shifting from threats to desperate begging. "Dad, please, I am begging you. They are going to send me to prison. I just had a little bad luck. You cannot be this cruel. I am your only son." I looked at the messages, my heart cold as winter stone. When they threw me out of the house on my birthday night, did they remember I was their husband and father? The 32nd call came as the sun was setting. I turned on the speaker. Paul's sobbing voice filled the room, mixed with Chloe's shouting and the voices of repossession agents in the background. Dad, please. They are sealing the house. I have nowhere to go. I took a deep breath. My voice echoed calmly through the empty office. Paul, you called me a pathetic old failure. You said my time was over. So why would a successful man like you need to beg a failure? You lost the only person who would have helped you the moment you chose to betray me. There is no we here anymore. There is only you and the consequences you created. He cried out, his voice breaking. Are you just going to let me die like this? I am not abandoning you, I replied coldly. I am simply letting you stand on the same feet you used to kick me out of my own home. Goodbye, Paul. I ended the call. That was the final one. Outside the window, I watched tow trucks pulling away their luxury cars. Chloe stood in the yard with 2 suitcases beside her, her face stunned as if she still could not believe what had happened. That shining mansion, those bright lights, were now nothing more than cold concrete that no longer belonged to them. Justice does not always come from a courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply allowing greedy people to taste the same cruelty they once delivered to others. The circle had closed. And tonight I was the only one who still had a real home to return to. A home built on truth, not on deception. 1 year later, I sat on the porch of a small but elegant villa that I designed and built with my own hands. Hendricks Renovations had become a leading company in the heritage restoration field. Half of my Uncle Thomas's land had been sold, giving me complete financial freedom. The remaining money I used to establish a scholarship fund for construction students who come from difficult backgrounds. I later heard that Chloe was now working at a roadside diner in another state. She serves the very people she once would not even look at. Paul is currently going through rehabilitation and working manual labor jobs to slowly pay off his debts. I do not hate them, but I will never go back. Some doors once closed should never be opened again. I watched the sun slowly setting behind the city's new buildings. Life has taught me one simple truth. It is never too late to start again. You can lose every possession you have, but if you keep your dignity and your strength, you can rebuild everything. What do you think about my journey? Do you believe I should forgive my son? Let me know your thoughts below. Do not forget to press like and share if this story gave you strength. I am Robert, and this is Dad's Real Life Revenge. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I smiled and took a sip of tea. The future ahead felt wide open and peaceful, because now I know that every brick I place from this moment forward will be a brick built on truth.